Hello, my name is Nigel Thorne. I'm from Wales and I have concerns with the Welsh Government's direction to teachers for the teaching of relationships and sexuality education, RSE. It is clear that many of our young people have been influenced by queer theory, specifically gender theory. This is a praxis-driven philosophy that is taught in university gender studies departments. A highly influential proponent of queer theory is Judith Butler, who, in her influential work Gender Trouble, defined the word gender as something that is performed. Butler believes that a gender identity results from that performance. This definition of gender is mutually exclusive with the Oxford English Dictionary definition, where gender is a synonym for sex. They can't both be true. But queer theory is not concerned with material reality. Queer theorists believe that power lies within language, and language is seen as a tool to manipulate people's perceptions so as to undermine social norms. Butler's ideas have spread widely throughout academia and have influenced young people's discourse on social media, especially Tumblr, where in the early years of the 2010s, teenage girls created or popularized a range of gender and sexual identities. Young people began to believe that we all have a gender identity that is independent of our body. This is an ideological belief. At the same time, referrals to the Gender Identity Services, GIDS clinic in the UK, were steadily increasing, and the profile of children referred changed from predominantly young boys to predominantly adolescent girls. In normal times, we would expect our government to direct schools to teach children of the dangers of this ideology, which invites comparisons with Gnostic thinking of bygone years. We do not live in normal times. In a statement made in 2018, Kirsty Williams, then Education Minister in the Welsh Government, stated, 30 years on from the introduction of Section 28, we will also ensure that RSE is fully inclusive of all genders and sexualities. The current Education Minister, Jeremy Miles, fully supported her statement. In the same year, the Welsh Assembly, as then was, came top in the Stonewall Best Employer list. Presiding officer Ellen Jones said the Assembly was truly honoured by the accolade. It was one of 8 Welsh organisations in Stonewall's list of top 100 employers. Kirsty Williams was no doubt influenced by Professor Emma Reynolds, an academic from Cardiff University, who has herself been massively influenced by Judith Butler. In her 2006 paper, They Won't Let Us Play Unless You're Going Out with One of Them, Girls, Boys and Butler's Heterosexual Matrix in the Primary Years, Reynolds wrote, the heteronormativity of gender relations in the early years is certainly ripe for some gender trouble, and some of this work is well underway and radically disrupting a range of gender and sexual truths in what might be more fittingly described as the heteroformative years. In an online interview, American writer, author and teacher Derek Jensen talked to feminist writer, activist and educator Susan Cox about the intellectual underpinnings of queer theory and its influence in academia.
So today I'd like to talk about queer theories. It feels like there's been something of a coup in academia, sort of a silent coup, and also in discourse in general. And at this point, this thing called queer theory frankly seems to control a lot of academia these days and a lot of public discourse, but I'm sure that a lot of people haven't heard of it. What is queer theory?
So, Derek, you're certainly right in that there has been this massive coup in academia of queer theory, and we see it pretty much everywhere, especially in feminism today. So queer theory basically problematizes what's called the binary opposition For example, man versus woman. Queer theory argues that binary oppositions are inherently hierarchical, in that one term is privileged over the other as the primary, and the other term is merely its deviant or derivative. For example, man is primary and woman is merely the negation of man. For example, in psychoanalysis, women were theorized as being merely the lack of the penis. So queer theory argues that we need to deconstruct all of these social binary oppositions. For example, man versus woman, heterosexual versus homosexual, natural versus artificial, nature versus culture. And we do this through the strategy of queering. And queering is basically a strategy of conceptual and categorical border transgression, in which each category becomes essentially meaningless and not distinct from the other. For example, if we take man and redefine man as not being a male person, but whoever feels like a man, then we've queered that category and it is no longer distinct from woman. And this is seen as a progressive movement in getting rid of social oppression. Because queer theory views oppression as springing not from one class of people subordinating another and exploiting them for labor and resources for their material benefit, but oppression comes from this very act of labeling these groups in a binary fashion, which is seen as restrictive and oppressive, and people cannot express their authentic selves in this binary opposition. So when oppression is seen not as arising from these material relations of power, these class relations, but instead the labeling of these relations in a binary fashion, of putting people into these groups of categories, then it really drops power out of the equation. For example, Judith Butler, in her seminal text, Gender Trouble, which came out in 1990, at the beginning of the third wave of feminism and was hugely influential to the third wave, she argues that patriarchy is, she celebrates the fact that the term patriarchy has lost currency in recent feminist theory, and that we cannot identify males as a class as the oppressors of females, because this is too totalizing a gesture. And actually, this is not how it works, but oppression springs from these discursive structures of binary oppositions. And if we identify males as the oppressor class, that only works to strengthen the binary opposition.
So let me get this straight. Even though 25% of all women in this culture have been raped in their lifetime by males, and another 19% have had to fend off rape attempts, this is not naming the fact that it is males who are raping females does not actually help to at least begin to address this atrocity, but instead, please finish that sentence because I can't.
But instead, when females unite together in feminism, it is said to only strengthen the gender binary, which is the source of all oppression. So it became really popular in feminist theory in the 80s and 90s to say that women are not oppressed by virtue of these material relations of power, but by the category of woman itself. So they argued that feminism needed to proceed without reference to the category of woman, and that females could not be the subject of feminism, as it was an exclusionary move, and that all of feminism's actions had to be inclusive of all individuals. So what happened with the rise of queer theory is that feminism became very symbolic, that the war that feminism needs to fight is merely on the symbolic level of erasing certain categories from language. The feminist theory of the social construction of gender is that it is coercively instated so that female persons are organized into the subordinate class of women. And women are positioned as being illogical, frivolous, subservient, naturally caring, and sexually subordinate to males. And men are characterized as brave, active, intelligent, logical, leaders. And so we can see how gender is basically the ideology that props up these two classes. But in queer theory, they took the feminist theory of gender and made it into this all-pervasive plot to capture complex individuals into these restrictive binary boxes. And that itself is oppressive. So queer theory idealizes individual performances of the self that exceed these binaries. For example, Eve Sedgwick says that subversive binary performances of the self are BDSM practitioners. She says something like radical fairies, leather men, all of these sort of surprising performances of the self. And for queer theory, you can't simply break out of the binary opposition or refuse one pole of the binary opposition because this only strengthens it. And the second wave of feminism identified heterosexuality, and more specifically compulsory heterosexuality, as a main regime of women's oppression. And so queer theory took that and said that, for example, radical lesbianism or political lesbianism was not a productive feminist strategy at all, because merely refusing heterosexuality strengthened the binary between heterosexual and homosexual. And what instead needed to happen was a queering of the binary entirely, so blurring the distinction between heterosexual and homosexual. And, for example, Eve Sedgwick argues that lesbianism is not a subversive refusal of male power at all, but what is really subversive is lesbians who have sex with men. And Judith Butler said pretty much the same thing. She said that lesbianism was not productive, but rather a man who is performing femininity, wearing feminine clothing, and that sexual relation is a much more complex production of power and subversive.
So, once again, my brain is continuing. It's past exploding and simply melting at this point. And so is part of what you're saying is that if it seems like your perspective would be that a little girl should not be forced into, quote, femininity by being disallowed from working on a car engine, but and instead being forced to play with dolls. And you would say that is forcing her into the structure of femininity if she is not allowed. I mean, if she wants to play with dolls, that's fine, but if she wants to work on a truck, that's fine too. Is this correct so far?
Yes, that's correct. And that is the feminist theory. That is the feminist stance on the matter.
And so the queer theory perspective would be that a little girl who likes to play with trucks or likes to work on trucks is finish the sentence, please.
Is not a girl at all, basically. So what queer theory does, because you cannot refuse one end of the binary opposition or strengthen the oppressed end of the binary opposition, we need to do away with it entirely. So it argues that you cannot merely be a woman and say, I'm a female, but I do not ascribe to femininity. I do not do femininity. I like things which are traditionally relegated to the realm of men, and this is no longer seen as something productive. Instead, queer theory asserted the theory of performativity. So this is what Judith Butler is very famous for. She said that woman is not just a female person, but it is a performance. There is no such thing as real women, as woman is nothing but a parody without origin. So we're all just sort of performing this idea of femininity, and there is no such thing. There is no femaleness underneath femininity. So queer theory focuses on subverting the distinction between sex and gender. Originally, feminist theory said there is sex, there are males and females, and then there is all this made-up nonsense, which is gender.
Obviously, there's males and females, so it wouldn't be babies.
Yes, but queer theory says no, males and females are just as fictitious as the gender categories of what's feminine and masculine. And this has been really, really harmful for, asserting any sort of positive feminist image of the woman who flouts femininity, but is still a woman nonetheless.
So it seems to me, I'm going to throw out a philosopher here too, that there is what Whitehead called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which is where you forget, it's in non-philosophical language, that's confusing the map for the territory. And it seems to me, we're all aware of that you have a map, and if the map doesn't fit the real world, then you know that there's a problem with the map. But it seems to me that aren't these queer theorists saying that there is actually no real world and there is only the map?
Yes, these queer theorists are saying this, which is very much influenced from postmodernist philosophy, which basically says there is no real world onto which the illusions of society are cast, but it is nothing but a world of smoke and mirrors. So there is no such thing as a real woman or real man,
or real
aka
nature.
Males and females, or real nature.
At the same time as Kirsty Williams' 2018 statement, it was announced to kickstart this process, £200,000 will be made available to education consortia so they can begin the process of identifying professional learning needs in this area. One of those consortia is the Central South Consortium, which covers schools in the local authority areas of Bridgend, Cardiff, Merthyr Tydfil, Rhondda Cynon Taf and Vale of Glamorgan. Central South Consortium have employed the services of Brook Cymru, an offshoot of Brook, who describe themselves as sexual health and well-being experts. Brook have worked closely with Professor Emma Reynolds. Brook put a heavy focus on teaching children about pleasure and encouraged teachers to sign a pleasure pledge. Some people have concerns. On their website, Brook described the belief that sex is binary and a scientific truth as just one of a number of equally valid views. Again, on their website, Brook provide a range of free resources that can be used by schools, including the National LGBT+T Partnership Terminology Guide, which contains comprehensive yet flexible definitions useful for children and teachers to learn, such as homonormativity, the privileging of a particular idea of what it means to be LGBTQ+, based on conflating wider LGBTQ+ experiences with a dominant gay, male, cisgendered, and usually white experience, which either varies little from the heterosexual ideal and or does little to disrupt heteronormativity. This is not a movement that values dialogue. On the same page is a link to a LGBT ABC handout. The handout is Gender Identity Ideology Propaganda, which accepts as fact the highly contested belief that we all have a gender that is independent of our biological sex. Cisgender is defined as where your gender matches the sex you were assigned at birth. To queer the boundary between heterosexual and homosexual, homosexual is defined as someone who is sexually attracted to someone of the same gender as themselves. Confusingly, gay is defined as a widely accepted term for same-sex attractions. The leaflet relies on the queer theory definition of gender, not the Oxford English Dictionary one. Brook have completely bought into gender identity ideology, that everyone has a gender identity that is independent of their biological sex. This is having an impact on children's psychology. Brook will be training your children's teachers. Parents and teachers across the UK are sharing testimonies of the impact of this new teaching on the website freetospeak.co.uk. Those who would prefer their children not to be taught that they could change sex when they're older by getting an operation may wish to support Public Child Protection Wales, who are campaigning against the RSE code. Links are included.